My wife's lover invited her to a romantic dinner in front of me. We were all in the same room, a group of friends gathered in an elegant restaurant in the city, glasses clinking, laughter and diffused lights reflecting on the cutlery. I was sitting next to her, as always, thinking it was still us. But he, with a cold and confident smile, raised the glass and said, looking directly at her, as if completely ignoring her husband's presence, "Thursday, in the same place as always? I'm waiting for you." She hesitated for half a second. Half a second. But he smiled. A disguised, brief smile, but one that I knew like the back of my hand. And in that moment, my world, our world, silently collapsed. No one noticed except me. Nobody imagined what that half-second, that restrained smile, that look that avoided mine with cruel dexterity, meant. I spent the next few days in a state of alert. Mentally reviewing her every gesture, every lame excuse from the last few months, every night she claimed tiredness, a headache or a late meeting. I started listening better. Paying attention. To watch. Because there is a moment when the heart stops being stupid and begins to distrust what the eyes pretended not to see. I wanted to be wrong. God, how I wish I was wrong. But it wasn't. The following Thursday, I waited for her to get ready calmly, to put on her makeup with that dedication that she hadn't offered me in a while. The blouse she wore was new, her nails were freshly done, the perfume was one she only put on special occasions. He said he was going to meet a friend. I just nodded. Smiling. I kissed her forehead, said, "Good night," and closed the door with a lump in my throat, but with my heart resolved. I waited 10 minutes and left the house. I followed her car with the headlights off along familiar streets. The restaurant was not far away. One of those that pretends to be discreet, but where no one goes to be invisible. When she got out of the car, she looked around. She disguised herself, as if she were afraid of being recognized. Then he appeared. And they hugged. He held her face with both hands as if it were something precious. And she smiled like that. In that damn way. The same smile that was once mine alone. I waited for them to enter. I gave it 20 minutes. And I went. I entered slowly, with heavy steps and my soul raw. When they saw me, they both froze. He dropped the cup and it shattered on the floor. She turned pale. He swallowed hard. He tried to speak. He didn't make it. The waiter looked scared. And I just walked to the table, without saying a word. Their silence was the most deafening confession of my life. That was the trigger. But not the beginning. Because the real beginning was in her every omission, every time she looked into my eyes and said, "I love you," while lying. Every night you lay next to me after giving yourself to someone else. In every mechanical touch, every cold kiss, every, "I'm tired," full of lies. What I discovered later was even worse. She had been seeing him for months. I was the idiot who brought flowers while she undressed for someone else. The fool who prepared dinner while she sighed for hidden messages. The clown who celebrated birthdays and memories that, to her, no longer meant anything. And like every betrayed person, I went through the phases. The denial, the despair, the anger, the desire for destruction. I thought about getting revenge. In cheating back. To end her, him, everything. But something inside me made me wait. Because sometimes, the best scam is the naked truth. And it was the truth that was responsible for delivering justice. On the night of the meeting, while they were still recovering from the shock, a brown-haired woman entered the restaurant with firm steps. Nobody knew who she was. But she knew. She knew everything. It was his wife. Yes. My wife's lover was married. And his wife followed him like I followed my wife. And in that same restaurant, at the same time, their world collapsed. She approached the table, looked at the two of them and just said, "I also came to dinner." She took her cell phone out of her bag and showed the photos, the prints, the schedules. He tried to deny it, tried to beg. My wife shrank in her chair, like a child caught in the act. But there was no more escape. His wife, with frightening calm, turned to me and said, "I'm sorry for you. I know how it hurts, too." And there, in that shared pain, something strange appeared. A respect. A silent understanding. And, who knew, a bow. Over the next few days, her mask fell off. And I saw a stranger in my house. The same one who slept next to me now spoke with a rehearsed guilt, tears that seemed sincere, but that no longer reached me. He asked for forgiveness. He said he regretted it. That I didn't know how things got to this point. That he still loved me. But true love doesn't hurt like that. Love doesn't lie. Love does not hide behind excuses and false affection. She tried to go back. Tried to fix it. But something in me had died. Something she killed herself. I moved. I needed air, space, to find who I was before she betrayed me. And it was in the midst of the chaos, the reconstruction, the emotional grief that I met the woman from the restaurant again. The lover's wife. We met by chance, in a small cafe in the city, a few weeks later. We look at each other as accomplices in the same pain. And without knowing it, we began to heal each other. She listened to me without judging me. I listened to her pain without interrupting. And in those conversations, there was more honesty than my entire marriage. She knew exactly what I felt, because she felt the same way. The anger, the humiliation, the shame, the disappointment. But, above all, the desire to follow. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. But it was true. And little by little, we started laughing again. Going out, building new memories. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Desired. Important. Meanwhile, my ex was wallowing in regrets. She discovered that her lover was lying to both of them. That he wasn't the Prince Charming she imagined. That she traded a home for an emptiness. He tried to come back, of course. He looked for me. He cried. He knelt down. But time doesn't come back. And forgiveness doesn't always bring love back. What she didn't know was that while she was trying to pick up the pieces of what she destroyed, I was already rebuilt. And loving again. But this time, by someone who would never allow me to feel invisible. And now, when I look back, I don't feel hate. I feel sorry. Because she lost a man who would do anything for her. And all for a man who wouldn't do anything. But there is a detail to this story that no one has ever discovered. A detail that would change everything. Something that happened the night of the dinner. A secret that only I know. Something I never told anyone. Not even for her. Not even for the woman I'm with now. A gesture. A choice. An attitude that changed everything and that, if revealed, would explain much more than any words. What happened that night that changed the course of history? Now that you know the pain, are you ready to find out what really happened? Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear from the beginning, we do not support and never romanticize betrayal. All stories told are fictitious, but they are born from the real pain that infidelity causes. Our goal is to show, in an intense and emotional way, how betrayal destroys homes, hearts and destinies. Get ready. What you will hear now is shocking, engaging and unforgettable. Good story. Daniel has always been a centered, meticulous man with calm gestures. At 43 years old, his features carried the serenity of someone who believed he had achieved everything he needed. Married to Laura for 17 years, he shared a life with her that, in anyone's eyes, would be considered enviable. A marriage built on solid foundations, 2 teenage daughters who were about to start college, a large house in a quiet neighborhood and a business of their own that prospered slowly but surely. Daniel owned a small technology consulting company, and although the work involved long, silent hours in front of the computer, he always found time to come home before dinner and sit at the table with his family, listening to each family report on their day. It was there, between mouthfuls and routine smiles, that he believed harmony resided, as if the foundations of his life were permanently anchored in that sacred ritual. Laura, in turn, was the type of woman who captivated with her subtle presence. His 40 years did not diminish in any way the vitality he carried in his eyes and voice. She was a literature teacher at a private school and, between the walls of the classroom and the piles of tests to correct, she found space to cultivate an old passion, photography. I spent hours on weekends strolling through fairs, parks, or even my backyard, looking for different angles to capture small moments of everyday life. Daniel admired her look at simple things. He found it fascinating how she saw beauty where he usually saw only function. She was the poetic contrast to his exact logic, and it was precisely this difference that, over the years, had kept the relationship alive. The couple had a peaceful relationship, without major disruptions, without frequent arguments. Laura had an easy laugh, and Daniel, although more reserved, knew how to listen to her with attention and respect. They had a silent agreement between them. When one of them needed silence, the other gave space. When one needed a hug, the other offered his arms. There were no big promises or cinematic gestures, but there was a comfortable, almost predictable constancy. Many saw this as a kind of mature love, free from destructive passions, and perhaps that is why it seemed so strong. However, in the silence of routines, certain small fissures began to emerge, invisible to the naked eye, but noticeable to anyone paying attention to details. Sundays, which were once sacred for family outings, began to become days of unavoidable commitments. The nightly conversations on the balcony, which used to last for hours under the sound of crickets, were being replaced by nights in which everyone took refuge in their own corner. Daniel, in the office, absorbed by spreadsheets and graphs, Laura, in the improvised studio in the garage, developing photographs and editing images. The words that used to flow effortlessly started to be carefully chosen, as if there was fear of hurting or provoking something that both of them still didn't know how to name. Despite this, there was affection. There was consideration, care, and a mutual desire to keep the peace. Daniel still left notes with little messages on the refrigerator door, and Laura still prepared the coffee exactly how he liked it, with 2 spoons of sugar and a splash of milk. There were kisses before leaving for work, although quicker. There were glances exchanged in the hallways of the house, although less frequent. The gestures were all there, but somehow they seemed smaller, as if they had shrunk in size without anyone noticing. The family routine followed its course with lightness and predictability. The daughters, Julia and Helena, were sweet teenagers, dedicated to their studies, involved in extracurricular activities and little given to rebellion. Daniel was proud of them as someone contemplating a work in progress. He was already beginning to prepare himself, emotionally, for the moment when they would leave the nest, trying not to show the anguish he felt seeing them grow so quickly. Laura, although more expressive, also silently carried the same tightness in her chest, disguised with smiles and plans for a future trip as a couple. On their wedding anniversaries, they had a tradition. They would go out to dinner at the same Italian restaurant where they had celebrated their first month together. It was a modest place, but with a beautiful view of the city and an old waiter who still remembered them both. At these dinners, they toasted with wine and remembered old stories. It was in these moments that Daniel believed everything was okay. That, despite the tiredness, the absences and the short distances, love resisted. Laura, at these dinners, was sweet, nostalgic, and always ended the night thanking him for being the man with whom she shared her life. And Daniel believed. I wanted to believe. They had mutual friends, a small and faithful circle. On Saturdays, they welcomed couples for dinner at home or went to other people's homes for evenings of wine and conversation. They laughed, discussed films, exchanged book tips. Social life was simple but active. Daniel felt comfortable in that role, the gentle husband, the elegant wife, the couple that many envied. And that was exactly why, at no point did it cross his mind that something might be wrong. That, behind the cordial hugs and peaceful dinners, something was being kept. Or worse, cultivated. At work, Daniel was also respected. He had a small but loyal team. One of the reasons why he was able to keep his schedule organized was precisely this, the trust he had built with his collaborators over the years. He was methodical but fair. He demanded deadlines, but understood limitations. The office was about 20 minutes from home, and he always made a point of coming back for lunch at least twice a week. These lunches, with Laura, had become little oases in the midst of the busyness of the week. And even when she couldn't, because of classes or meetings at school, he would leave a note on the table, "I thought about you during lunch. I love you." Laura responded with brief messages on her cell phone, often with a photo of the dessert she had made. It felt like love. Maybe it was. But love alone, without presence, sometimes empties without anyone noticing. Time passed. Commemorative dates came and went. Daughters' birthdays, family holidays, end-of-year parties with her parents, short trips. Everything was going with the appearance of normality. And there were, yes, moments of legitimate affection. Small gestures that made Daniel believe that the base was intact. That's what life was, made of stability, of silent achievements, of complicit looks even without big gestures. He was not a man who expected explosive emotions. I preferred calm. The contained affection. And Laura has always been like this, restrained, soft, constant. But there were nights. There were a few nights when Daniel woke up and noticed the cold bed next to him. In which Laura said she went to the kitchen to drink water or that she couldn't sleep. And there were mornings when she seemed distant, oblivious. But there was always an explanation ready. And he accepted. Because he loved it. Because I trusted. Because I didn't know how to live in a state of suspicion. The scenery that surrounded them was serene. An organized house, a backyard with a well-kept garden, a small studio in the back where she had set up her gallery of favorite photographs. He had his award-winning photos framed on the walls, some taken during trips to small towns, others captured in the backyard on rainy days. Daniel sometimes stopped by just to watch her create. I thought the sparkle in her eyes was beautiful when she talked about light, composition, textures. And although I didn't understand anything about art, I found it charming. It was a life built on commitment, affection, and time. A life that, in the eyes of many, was an example of stability, partnership, and lasting love. But there are things that hide between the lines, in the blank spaces, in the silences that no one dares to fill. And there was something there. Something he still couldn't name. But it already touched him in some deep layer of his soul. Like a shadow that creeps in, even when the sun is still shining. And it is on this calm surface that everything seems to remain. Until a small crack appears. And over time, it doesn't just grow, it devours. Daniel began to notice subtle changes in Laura's behavior. Initially, they were almost imperceptible details, so small that he dismissed them as the result of stress or routine. A different perfume, used on random days and that didn't match the alleged commitments. Departures began to become more frequent, with justifications ranging from pedagogical meetings outside of school to invitations from colleagues to cultural events. At first, he saw no reason to question it. After all, he always trusted her and knew how much she valued her own freedom and individuality. However, the sum of silences began to become louder than any argument. He felt when she avoided eye contact at certain times, when she pretended to be interested in conversations and seemed distant, even though she was present. The nights were long again. Laura sometimes took a long time to go to bed, claiming to be immersed in a photographic project or organizing tests. Daniel, respecting his space, simply said good night and retired. But there was something about that silence that bothered him. He began to notice that when she finally lay down, her body seemed more tense, as if it were always ready to bolt at the slightest movement. She fell asleep quickly, but restlessly, and sometimes mumbled names or disjointed phrases. Daniel, alone in his thoughts, tried to find logic where there was only uncertainty. I wanted to believe it was paranoia, but the restlessness gained strength day after day. At the company, he began to lose focus. Important meetings became blurs, decisions were postponed, and attention, once precise, was lost in daydreams. Colleagues noticed the change, but no one dared comment. He wasn't the type to open up easily, he preferred to keep his discomforts to himself, as he always did. It was in this state of silent introspection that he began to take small investigative actions. He checked the shared credit card statement, something he had never done, and found purchases at places she had never mentioned. Different beauty salons, restaurants they didn't go to together, spending on private transport at unusual times. He wrote everything down. I didn't know yet what I would do with that information, but I needed to understand. One night, when he arrived home from work early, he found the house empty. Laura had left, leaving only a note saying that she had a meeting with other teachers in the city center. Curious, Daniel went to her office, a room he rarely accessed, and sat down on the chair she used to correct papers. On the table, there was a folder with random papers, and among them, a small, recently developed photograph, still slightly damp at the edges. The image was artistic, capturing the reflection of two wine glasses on a wooden table, with a male silhouette in the background, almost imperceptible. But for Daniel, that was enough. He knew that look through the lens. It was intimate, it was personal. And it wasn't for him. He started putting pieces together. In his silence, he thought up the questions he still didn't have the courage to ask. I observed the patterns, the schedules, the looks she exchanged with people in public places. He began to notice a certain sparkle in her eyes after a few meetings. A lightness that he hadn't seen in a long time and that, tragically, wasn't directed at him. Still, he tried hard not to show it. I wanted to be sure before making any accusations. He wanted to have proof, even if it cost him sleepless nights and days of contained anguish. It was on a Saturday afternoon that everything began to take shape. They had been invited to a dinner with friends, as often happened. It was a small, intimate group, made up of old couples and some of Laura's work colleagues. The atmosphere was relaxed, lit by candles and accompanied by light music. Daniel maintained a discreet smile, chatting with the other men about politics and business, while observing his wife with a clinical look. She laughed easily, moved lightly, and there was something about the way she carried herself that was no longer familiar. At one point, one of the guests approached her with a seemingly harmless gesture. He touched her shoulder and whispered something in her ear. Laura smiled, as if it was just a joke. But what Daniel saw in that second was more than that. It was complicity. And it was there that certainty finally set in. In the days that followed, Daniel hatched a plan. He was not an impulsive man, and even with his heart hurt, he kept his reasoning clear. He discreetly installed a tracking app on her cell phone. It was an invasion that embarrassed him, but he justified it to himself as the only way to know the truth without noise. He observed the movements for 2 weeks. There was a pattern. Always on Thursdays, between 7 and 10 at night, she would park the car at the same address in the center. There were no schools, no bookstores, or anything to justify that recurrence. And it was then that he decided to go personally. The following Thursday, when he saw her leave with the same excuse as always, he took his car keys, put on his coat and left 15 minutes later. He kept his distance, driving cautiously, his heart racing and his hands sweating on the steering wheel. When she stopped the car, he parked 3 blocks away and continued on foot. As he turned the corner, he saw everything. She got out of the vehicle with a smile on her face, fixed her hair with her hands and looked around. A few seconds later, a man appeared from the door of a discreet restaurant. One of those intimate-looking places, with a red awning and low lights. They hugged each other naturally, as if it were something usual. She pressed her face against his chest and laughed at something he said. Daniel stood still. He couldn't move or think. He just watched, numb. He waited for them to enter. He gave himself time to compose himself and then walked to the restaurant. As he approached the entrance, the gaze of a curious waiter followed him. He said he had a reservation, gave some name, and with the excuse of waiting, he stayed in the entrance hall. From there, I could see almost the entire room. And there they were. Sitting next to a window, with a bottle of wine between them and a freshly served plate of pasta. She spoke excitedly. The man smiled with admiration. And it was when he held her hand on the table that Daniel felt something inside him crumble irreversibly. It was real. It was there. Before your eyes. The world he had built with so much zeal collapsed in silence, while the surrounding environment continued in its normality. He didn't go in. He didn't expose himself. He preferred to leave without being seen. He walked slowly back to the car, fighting the urge to confront them right there. But something told him to wait. There was still more to understand. More to discover. He still didn't know who the man was, nor what exactly existed between them. But betrayal, that was no longer a hypothesis. It was a fact. An open wound that bled beneath the skin, silent and brutal. That night he didn't come home. He drove for hours, with no clear destination. He thought of everything. In the daughters. In constructed life. In choices. How much he had donated for that relationship. And how absolutely useless it all seemed now. When dawn came, he parked the car near a park and stayed there, until the sun began to warm the windshield. He turned on his cell phone. Messages from Laura asking where she was. She said she was worried. I asked him to call. But nothing about those words seemed true. And yet, deep in his torn soul, Daniel knew that this was not the end. It was just the beginning of an even darker story. Because there was something about that scene that didn't fit. Something that still escaped his understanding. And the answer to that was closer than he could imagine. The morning after dinner in which he saw Laura holding hands with another man, Daniel woke up with a dry throat, burning eyes, and a crushed chest with pain so intense that it almost prevented his lungs from functioning. He spent hours staring at the ceiling of the small motel room where he had spent the night, immersed in silent, chaotic thoughts, as if his mind was spinning in circles in a storm. Nothing made sense. Images from the night before came and went like disconnected flashes, her smile, his touch, the way they both seemed comfortable, intimate, carefree, as if they were the only ones in that private world where he, ironically, was the intruder. But there was something beyond the betrayal that still worried Daniel, an uncomfortable detail that insisted on returning to his memory, like an invisible barb, the look of the woman who entered the restaurant minutes after he left. He saw her only at a glance, an elegant silhouette, hair tied up, steps determined. At that moment, he didn't pay attention. But now, her presence seemed to scream inside him. It didn't take long to discover who she was. A name written on a receipt paper forgotten on the console of Laura's car was enough of a clue. With a little research, he reached the woman's social networks. She was married. The same man Laura had dinner with was next to her in several smiling photos from recent trips and family parties. It was as if that parallel reality had hidden before his eyes for too long. The impact was devastating. His wife's betrayal alone had already broken him. But knowing that the man she was with was married made everything even more perverse. It wasn't just the breakdown of trust between husband and wife, it was the silent destruction of two entire families who, until that moment, had lived under the false idea of normality. And most cruel of all, he wasn't the only one betrayed. The decision to confront came days later, when Laura's looks became more nervous, her gestures more impatient and her excuses more fragile. Daniel realized that she was about to confess something, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear of being discovered. But she wouldn't be the one to have that power. He chose the moment. Chose the scenario. A private dinner, at home, like so many others they had already shared. But this time, the main course would be the truth. Laura arrived home from work exhausted, as she claimed, but she didn't refuse his invitation to sit at the table. The food was served, the wine glass was full, and the silence between them was thick. Daniel watched every movement, every hesitation, as if searching for a sign of regret. When she finally looked at him, something broke in the air. He took a deep breath and asked in a firm but non-angry voice, "How long has it been?" She froze. The cup in his hand shook slightly before being placed back on the table. She tried to deny it, but her eyes filled with tears before her mouth even moved. So there was no more pretending. 2 months, she said, almost in a whisper. 2 months, occasional meetings, but filled with an intensity that she confessed she hadn't felt in a long time. He tried to justify it. He spoke of lack, of routine, of the feeling of invisibility. Daniel listened to everything in silence, without interrupting. His heart ached, but he needed more. "I needed to understand why." She tried to touch his hand, but he backed away. He said he knew the man was married. That he had a family. And it was at that moment that Laura turned pale. The entire body stiffened. Daniel noticed. There was something more. Something she didn't want to say. So he went to the office, took the envelope with the photos he had taken of the dinner, placed it on the table and said he didn't accept being the only one to carry that pain. She opened the envelope with shaking hands. Upon seeing the images, the voice disappeared. He asked, "What about his wife? Does she know?" Laura shook her head, not having the courage to lie. "I did not know." And not just that. She also never knew anything, because, according to Laura, the man had assured her that their marriage was destroyed, that they lived as colleagues, that they slept in separate rooms. An old, repeated narrative, but one that she wanted to believe. Daniel then said that he had discovered who the man's wife was. And that she was also in the restaurant. She followed him, Laura. The same way I followed you. And she saw everything. At that moment, Laura put her hands to her face, suffocated by heavy tears, saying that she never wanted to hurt anyone, that she was weak, that she felt ashamed. But Daniel didn't want tearful confessions. I wanted truths. And that's when he asked the ultimate question, "Did you know I was there that night?" Laura took a while. He stared at the ground, bit his lip, hesitated. And then he said, "Yes. I saw you. I saw you when you entered. When he stopped in the hall. When he looked at me. And still, I didn't do anything." That landed like a punch. Not because of betrayal, but because of coldness. Due to the indifference of those who chose not to feel anything in the face of the suffering of others. And it was at that moment, at that exact moment when the world seemed to be about to fall apart for good, that Daniel's phone rang. He answered without thinking. On the other end of the line, the voice was firm but painful. The lover's wife. She said she needed to find him. He said there was something he needed to know. Something that would change everything. He scheduled the meeting for the next day, in a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. Daniel hesitated for a second, but accepted. The next day, upon arriving at the agreed location, he found a strong-looking woman, but with eyes marked by sleepless nights. She was direct. She said she confronted her husband. Which he confessed. And that, during the discussion, one detail escaped. A detail that until then seemed irrelevant, but that made her investigate. And that's how he discovered that Laura and him knew each other before. First of all. Years ago. On a work trip that Laura had taken without mentioning it to her husband. The two had crossed paths at that event, gotten closer, and kept in touch. According to her, the current case was not something new. It was a comeback. A reactivation of an old relationship that, somehow, had never ended. Daniel was silent. I tried to process it. Her words echoed like bullets ricocheting off the walls of his mind. But there was more. The woman revealed that, when searching her husband's emails, she found messages that showed that the meeting at the restaurant was not casual. It was a provocation. Daniel didn't understand. She then explained that the dinner was planned to happen that way. The place, the time, the exposure. Everything thought out. Because the man wanted to provoke. I wanted to show Daniel what he had achieved. It was a kind of personal revenge. Because, years before, they had worked at the same company, and Daniel, without knowing it, had been responsible for his dismissal, after rejecting a dubious project. The man held a grudge. And he saw in Laura a way to hurt him. She didn't know everything. But he does. And he used that to create the perfect situation. A cruel spectacle of emotional destruction. Daniel got up from the table as if in a dream. The body trembled. The stomach turned. Everything made sense. His smile in the restaurant. The security. The provocative look. It was personal. And Laura was an instrument. Consented or not, it was used. When he got home, she was waiting for him. And before he said anything, she said, "He told me. That was you. That it was for you. And that it was all revenge. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Daniel just looked at her for a long time, until he finally asked, "And now, what's left?" She cried. He remained silent. And it was there, in that silence full of revelations, that everything changed. What was just a betrayal became part of a carefully crafted perverse plan. And what remained now was to decide how to move forward after the destruction. Laura was crying, but it wasn't a silent or discreet cry. It was a desperate, contorted cry, of those who no longer know where to hold on. Sitting on the living room sofa with her elbows resting on her knees and her face buried in her hands, she begged, with a choked voice, for Daniel to say something, anything. But he remained standing, distant, standing in the center of the room as if trying to understand at what exact point reality had become a meticulously engineered nightmare. Each piece now fell into place with brutal logic: the arrogant smile of the man in the restaurant, the calculated hug, the almost victorious look when he saw him enter, the lack of surprise, the absence of guilt. It wasn't just an emotional or physical betrayal. It was a trap. And Laura, even if she didn't know it, participated in the performance. Still, there was a doubt pulsing through him, throbbing like a living wound. Did she really not know? Laura, between sobs, raised her face and whispered that she was ashamed, that she felt dirty, used. He said he never thought that man was capable of such perversity. Who believed in the sweet words he said, in the promises of freedom, in the empty plans for a future that, deep down, she didn't even want. She said the man made her feel desired again, seen, alive, but that now she realized he was just a piece in a game. A pawn driven by the anger of someone who has never swallowed a professional defeat. Daniel watched her with a calm that bordered on the unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but sharp. He asked if, at any point, she thought about him. If in any of these forbidden encounters she remembered who was at home. Laura tried to respond, but all she could do was repeat that she was confused, that she was lost, that she was sorry. Daniel slowly shook his head and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned around and said he needed air. And that perhaps, for the first time in years, he was thinking only of himself. He didn't come back that night. Not even the next one. He spent days in silence, staying in a small hotel far from the center, trying to find some way to reorganize his own thoughts. The anger was no longer as sharp, but there was a new, deeper, silent emptiness. A morning without a body. A marriage that still existed legally, but which emotionally was already crumbling into ashes. He read messages from Laura, long, insistent, some pleading, others in an almost poetic tone, but all permeated by the same feeling of belated regret. I deleted them one by one. She knew that responding now would be giving into the confusion she herself created. I needed time. But time, in itself, no longer offered answers. On the 5th day of his imprisonment, a discreet notification on his phone changed the course of things. It was a simple message, coming from the woman who had revealed the truth about Laura's lover. She asked if he was okay. If you needed to talk. Daniel, without thinking, answered yes. He arranged to meet her at the same cafe where they had seen each other last time. When he arrived, she was already there, sitting in the most private corner of the room, with a calm expression, but her eyes were visibly exhausted. He sat across from her and, for a few moments, neither of them said anything. There was a silent complicity between them, born of shared pain. A mutual recognition that went beyond words. She began by saying that she had started her separation process. She said she couldn't continue to be with someone who manipulated her so deeply. She said that her husband tried to reverse the situation, trying to convince her that everything was just an emotional outburst, a symbolic revenge, a phase. But she was already past the point of return. He said he looked at his children, at his own life, and realized that he could no longer live alongside someone who treated love as a currency of revenge. Daniel listened in silence. And when she stopped talking, he just murmured that he also didn't know if he wanted to rebuild anything with Laura. That something had broken in a way that he could no longer touch. She nodded, without trying to console, without forcing hope. It was just pure, honest understanding. In the days that followed, Daniel and she continued talking. They started to meet more often, not out of strategy or need, but because there was something genuine in the conversations, in the silences, in the way they listened to each other. Her name was Clara, and as he discovered her stories, her pains, her aborted dreams, he realized that there was a silent strength in her that contrasted with the lightness with which she faced the world. She laughed at small things, observed details carefully, and never pressed for answers. Daniel, in turn, found himself gradually stripping away the armor he had used his entire life to protect himself from emotions. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe without guilt. Meanwhile, Laura was plunged into a whirlwind of desperate attempts to fix the irreparable. I sent letters, recorded long audios, asked for meetings. Daniel was reluctant, but at a certain point he decided to listen. I needed to end that cycle with dignity. They arranged to meet in a square close to their daughter's old school, a place where, years ago, they used to walk hand in hand on Sundays. When she arrived, she was pale, visibly haggard. He carried in his eyes the weight of someone who had lost more than they imagined. She started by saying that she understood if he didn't want to see her anymore, but she needed to say out loud that she loved him. That even though she made mistakes, even allowing herself to be carried away by confused feelings and thoughtless decisions, she still loved him. Daniel listened. Carefully. But without emotion. He said he believed in her love, but that it was no longer enough. He said that love is not just feelings, it is attitude, it is care, it is respect. And that all of this was broken. Laura cried, asked for a chance, said she would do anything to rebuild what she had destroyed. But Daniel replied that she had already had all the chances in the world. That there was no fix without memory, and he didn't want to spend the rest of his life with someone who reminded him, every day, of the pain he felt. He said this calmly. There was no hate, just an end. She understood. And for the first time, he didn't insist. He just lowered his head and walked away, like someone carrying with him the remains of a mistake too big to be forgiven. Time passed. Daniel returned to the house, but now he was different. The house was the same, the furniture was in the same places, but there was a new silence, lighter, less oppressive. He began to reorganize his life, his routine, his priorities. The daughters, who learned about what happened sensitively, showed support without judgment. Little by little, the relationship with Clara also deepened. There was no rush, there was no charge. It was something that grew at the right pace, with care, with truth. They became each other's company in the late afternoons, at Sunday coffees, in long conversations about what they felt, what they feared, what they wanted. A year later, now officially separated from Laura, Daniel felt that something inside him had been reborn. Not the same, but new. He was no longer the same man as before. He had lost a lot, yes, but he had also gained something rare, self-awareness. I looked at Clara and felt gratitude. Not because she saved him, but because she appeared at the moment when he needed to learn to save himself. And as for Laura, she moved on with her life. He tried to rebuild himself among the shards of what was left, but he knew, somewhere inside, that he had lost what could never be replaced. Because sometimes the greatest punishment is not being left. It's realizing, too late, the value of those who are gone. And one Saturday, when passing by that same restaurant where it all started, Daniel stopped for a moment. He observed the movement, the couples entering, the waiters smiling. He thought about everything he had experienced since that night. And smiled. Not because you forgot. But because he survived. And moving forward, in itself, was the greatest victory. The days following his meeting with Laura marked a time of silent transition for Daniel. The words spoken in that square seemed to have been suspended in the air, hovering between them like a constant reminder that some bridges, even rebuilt, would never be the same. He returned home with a different weight on his chest, no longer that of raw sorrow, but that of a closure that he still couldn't name. He walked through the rooms with slow steps, touching objects that no longer awakened the same memories, and wondered in silence what was left of everything they had experienced. The photo frames, once full of meaning, now seemed to represent a frozen fiction, a performance that lasted for years. Still, he didn't remove them. Not out of attachment, but out of respect. I had learned that some pains needed to be honored before being left behind. Living with his daughters had become an even deeper bond. They, sensitive to their father's transformation, began to seek him out more frequently, not as someone who cares, but as someone who recognizes in him a space of safety that they didn't even know they needed before. Conversations became more honest, silences more comfortable, and connections truer. Daniel found himself listening better, observing more, delving into the details of his daughters with an interest that had previously been lost in the chaos of routine. He began to notice little versions of himself and Laura in them, subtle personality traits that now became more evident as they grew older. This reflection touched him in a strange way, as if they carried within them parts of a story that he was trying to overcome, but that also reminded him of what he had done right, the unconditional love he always had for that family, despite everything. Meanwhile, Clara followed by his side, with her discreet and constant presence. The relationship between the two evolved like a silent river that carves its way without fanfare, but with depth. There were no charges, just spontaneous deliveries. In each gesture, she demonstrated that she understood Daniel's time, respecting his silences and pauses. Often, she remained silent next to him for long minutes, allowing him to delve into his own reflections, without interrupting or trying to fill the void. That was rare. He felt seen, not as someone who needed to be cured, but as someone who deserved to be accepted in his entirety. This freedom, paradoxically, was what brought him closest to her. In Clara, he found not only welcome, but also an honest mirror of himself, someone who was also rebuilding his own ruins with firmness and courage. But there was still a shadow hanging over him, a question that insisted on returning in the silent dawns: to what extent was Laura a victim or an accomplice? The revelation of the revenge planned by that man and the confession that Laura knew who Daniel was in the restaurant still left him uneasy. As much as she claimed not to know about the bigger plan, the fact that she remained there, sitting, pretending to be normal while he stared at them, corroded something inside him. Was it coldness? Fear? Pride? Or just emotional blindness? The dilemma haunted him, not because he still loved Laura, but because understanding why was essential to truly moving forward. He wanted to know if she betrayed him out of weakness or out of ego. And maybe he never knew. It was in this whirlwind of thoughts that an unexpected invitation appeared. Clara proposed a short trip, just a weekend in a remote inn, surrounded by nature, a simple place, but far from everything that reminded her of her previous life. Daniel hesitated. I still didn't know if it was fair to her to dive into an experience that could become too intimate. But Clara, in her calm way, said she expected nothing more than his company. Just that. A time away from the voices, the looks, the signed papers, the archived messages and the traces of a house that still carried ghosts. And he accepted. The trip proved to be a necessary breath. The landscapes helped to silence mental noise, and the moments shared with Clara made him realize how it was possible, yes, to feel lightness again. She laughed spontaneously, effortlessly, and at no point did she try to erase or replace what he had experienced. On the contrary, she always looked at him as if saying, without words, that his past was welcome there, that it didn't compete with memories, but walked alongside them. And it was on one of those nights, sitting in front of the inn's fireplace, that Daniel allowed himself to talk more. He told details that he hadn't even told Laura. He confessed old fears, insecurities that came to the surface after the betrayal, and the fear of becoming a suspicious man, unable to love again. Clara held his hand and replied that loving again did not require forgetting what had happened, but rather accepting that the scars were part of the new skin. It wasn't about replacing the pain, but learning to walk with it, until one day, without realizing it, it stopped hurting. On the way home, something inside him had changed. It wasn't an abrupt restart, nor an official closure, but a faint feeling that the worst was over. He no longer felt anger, nor hurt, just a deep awareness that nothing would be the same as before, and that wasn't a bad thing. He gradually resumed his routine, redirecting his focus to the work and projects he had left aside. He carefully reorganized the house, removing objects that no longer made sense and replacing them with elements that reflected the new phase he was beginning to experience. He changed the curtains, changed the position of the furniture, and decided to keep a single old photograph on the shelf, an image of him and his daughters when they were still little, all smiling in the backyard. It was his way of preserving what he had truly built, even if other parts of that life had become corrupted. But destiny sometimes tests the heart when it begins to rebuild itself. Without warning, on a rainy afternoon, Daniel received a handwritten letter, delivered by a neighbor who found the envelope in the old mailbox. It was Laura's. Not a letter of supplication, like the previous ones, but a kind of confession. She said that she had been reflecting a lot, that she had started therapy, and that she wanted to tell him something that she never had the courage to say, that she had, indeed, noticed the signs that she was being used by that man. That at some point, even before everything exploded, something inside her already knew that it wasn't love, but she chose to continue. For the feeling of being desired, for the pleasure of feeling control over something after years of living in a relationship that she considered predictable. And that, yes, he saw Daniel enter the restaurant. And at that moment, it stuck. Because the shame was so great that he couldn't move. He asked for forgiveness not for the act itself, but for the cowardice of not having stopped him from suffering like that. She said she didn't want him to forgive her, but to at least understand that, as painful as it was, that betrayal had made her see herself for the first time in years. Daniel read the letter more than once, in silence. He didn't cry, he didn't tremble, he didn't feel angry. Just a strange feeling of understanding. She was finally taking responsibility for her choices. Not seeking redemption, but assuming his humanity. And that, in some way, freed him. Because, deep down, he also needed to lose himself to find himself. As the weeks went by, he continued to get closer to Clara. Lightly, without rushing. The meetings became more frequent, the conversations deeper, and the looks more intense. They discovered that they shared simple dreams, cultivating a garden, traveling by car without destination, adopting a dog. Small wishes that, together, began to seem possible. And even with the past present, there was room for the new. Daniel now found himself faced with a new dilemma. He had in his hands the chance to start over with someone who understood his pain, who didn't demand a perfect version of him, but a true one. At the same time, he knew that there were still marks, shadows that would accompany him. He wondered if it was fair to Clara to start something deeper while still carrying such recent scars. She, sensitive as always, said that she preferred to walk alongside him in this process, even if it took time, even if there were uncertainties. And it was in this mutual surrender, in this courageous acceptance of imperfections, that Daniel began to understand what true love was. Meanwhile, Laura stayed away. He took care of himself, rebuilt his life the way he could, without any big announcements. There was a constant sadness in her, but also a desire not to repeat the same mistakes. It was too late to return, but perhaps not too late to change. And so, life took its course. Not like before. Not like a fairy tale. But like a real story, made of falls, new beginnings, losses and learning. And, in the midst of it all, Daniel discovered that the greatest revenge was not to destroy those who hurt him, but to live with dignity, in peace, with someone who chose to love not what he was, but what he became. Time advanced with firm and silent steps, as if it wanted to erase the footprints left by the previous months. Daniel now walked through the corridors of his new life with a serenity that did not come from the absence of pain, but from the certainty that everything that needed to be faced, was. The weight that once kept him hunched over was now just a memory. The wounds that left him immobile had healed, and in the place of pain was a bitter and profound wisdom. Clara was a fundamental part of this transformation. Not as a savior or substitute for a destroyed past, but as a witness to a rebirth. She was by his side on good days and on days when the past still knocked on the door, bringing bitter and unexpected memories. She didn't ask him to move forward faster, nor did she feel threatened by the shadows that sometimes appeared when he looked at his daughters and remembered the home he once built. The love between them was born from the barren land of disappointment, but it blossomed because it was watered with truth, patience and respect. Daniel finally decided to sell the old house. It wasn't an easy choice. That house carried in every room vivid memories of a story that, despite having ended in emotional tragedy, had its years of beauty and meaning. On the day he left the keys with the broker, he walked through the empty spaces with slow steps. The room where the daughters learned to read, the room where so many birthday parties took place, the kitchen that was often the scene of intimate conversations to the sound of boiling water and discreet laughter. Everything there was a sanctuary of real moments, and he decided it wasn't fair to carry resentment completely. Forgiving did not mean forgetting, but choosing not to let the past steal what was still good. And with that decision, a final part of his soul seemed to break free. Laura followed a lonely path, not because of a lack of options, but because she decided to face her own reconstruction with the dignity she had left. He spent months in silence, away from social media, from mutual friendships, from the life he led with Daniel. He moved to a small apartment, where he started over with the basics. He resumed his career with more commitment, immersed himself in old books, returned to art groups and began to use his photography as a kind of catharsis. Their images have changed. If before they were focused on flowers, landscapes and light compositions, now they started to carry raw emotions, aged faces, melancholic looks, empty streets, intense contrasts of light and shadow. She won awards, received invitations to exhibitions, and for the first time, she began to feel like her art was connecting with something bigger than herself. But deep down, he carried regret like a tattoo on his soul. I knew there was no going back to what I had before. And even though she was courted by other men, she was never able to give herself completely. Her confidence in herself, in her judgments, was irreversibly shaken. And perhaps that was his harshest punishment, knowing that the most sincere love he had in his life was also the one he destroyed with his own hands. The man she had gotten involved with faced a fate worthy of what he sowed. After the betrayal and his revenge strategy were exposed, he lost his position in a respectable company. The image of an upstanding businessman crumbled, and the doors closed one by one. His wife, Clara, firmly filed the separation process, demanding not only custody of the children, but also emotional reparation for the years of manipulation. He tried to fight back, but discovered that the power he thought he had was supported only by an artificial reputation. He spent months trying to rebuild his career elsewhere, but his name was tarnished. He became one of those that everyone avoids, the one who smiles with desperation in his eyes, trying to convince the world that he is another man, when deep down he still carries the usual arrogance. Isolated, without confidence or a support network, he has plunged into an abyss from which he may never be able to escape. Clara, on the other hand, flourished. Not because of the fall of her ex-husband, but because of the courage with which she decided to rebuild her own story far from lies. He turned pain into strength. He started again professionally with a courage that surprised even his closest friends. She started giving talks on emotional resilience, on how to get up after big falls, and became an inspiration for other women who, like her, lived in silence under the shadow of toxic relationships. But, above all, he found a rare partnership in Daniel. A union without games, without rush, with space for the truth and for flaws. Between them there was a trust built from the most raw sincerity, and each new step was taken with the care of someone who understands that already broken hearts touch each other with delicacy. Daniel and Clara decided, a year later, to go on a long trip. Not as an escape, but as a celebration. A car journey along unknown roads, without fixed maps, just with the desire to see what the world could still offer. It was the perfect symbol for what they became together, two survivors who allowed themselves to walk side by side without the rush to get anywhere. During the trip, they talked about everything: childhood, old age, regrets, dreams and fears. They laughed, they cried, they loved. And, at some point on the road, without any ceremony or rehearsal, Daniel held her hand and said that, even though he could never erase what he experienced, he would choose, every day, to be with her. Clara didn't respond with words. He just laid his head on his shoulder, as if to say, I know. And there, between the sound of the wind and the gentle roar of the engine, they made a silent commitment, not to repeat the mistakes of the past, to live truthfully, to walk lightly. Daniel's daughters, now more mature, also became his friends. They admired their father's relationship with Clara, and saw in it a type of love that was beautiful because it was possible, because it was real, because it didn't try to imitate fairy tales. They understood, with the depth of those who grew up too quickly, that true love is the one that survives pain, but also knows how to leave when necessary. Laura, in turn, was still trying to rebuild the bond with them. There were good moments, sincere gestures, but I knew that some wounds, no matter how much they heal, leave visible marks. It was not rejected, but it was also no longer a safe haven. It was just part of the story. And, over time, he learned to accept this role with the humility he previously lacked. And so, over the years, the chapters closed naturally. What began with a brutal betrayal turned into a journey of rebirth, emotional justice, and personal reconstruction. None of those involved emerged unscathed, but everyone, in their own way, found a reflection of what they offered to the world. Some with peace, others with guilt. Some with love, others with emptiness. Life, relentless and fair, followed its course, and in the end, Daniel understood that the pain he thought would destroy him was the same one that taught him to live more truthfully. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? What would you have done in Daniel's place? Do you think Laura deserved forgiveness? Or that Clara was the real turning point of this plot? Leave your opinion in the comments, I'd love to know what you think. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Here, the stories are strong, real and impactful, always with a lasting lesson. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our goal is to show how it can ruin lives and teach the value of respect, truth and conscious choice. Until the next story.